This evening, I take great pleasure in welcoming Caroline Anderson, one of our fantastic team of volunteers. You may know Caroline as the amazing photographer and writer of our Nature in the Glen posts on Kilmartin Museum's social media. But this evening, we are lucky to have Caroline talking about a subject that she's very passionate about. Her talk this evening is titled That All These Were Witches. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Caroline.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Hi, everybody. So I am going to preface this talk with a disclaimer by saying I'm not an expert on the Scottish witch trials. I'm more of an enthusiastic amateur with a wish for those who were accused to be remembered. I was horrified at the number of people, mostly women, who were accused and executed in Scotland. And indeed, Scotland had about 5 times the number of executions compared to the European average. When I found out that there had been a witch hunt on Bute, which as the crow flies is not too far away from where I live, I wanted to find out more. And my excitement was piqued when I discovered that the confessions of 6 of the women accused were still in existence at Inveraray Castle archives. I contacted Alison Diamond, the archivist, to see if I could view them. However, at the time I did my final university project, based on the accused of Bute, the original documents couldn't be found, so I worked from a transcript which had been carried out in the 1920s or 30s. But a recent chance discussion with Alison revealed that the original documents had been found, and so I hot-footed it to the archives to see them. Any handwritten text you see as part of this talk, photographs of the actual confession documents. Before we hit on the documents, I'll go through a bit of the background to the witch hunts, and then we'll have a look at the confessions. So I hope you're sitting comfortably. For the story you're about to hear, it's a very sad one from a very dark period of Scotland's history, which saw thousands of innocent people accused of witchcraft. So if I could ask you to suspend your 21st century beliefs and embrace a time when it was believed the devil literally walked the earth, and any act of healing or harming by herbs, words, and rituals was believed to be powerful, especially in the hands of a few who went under the name of witch. Some of the details are distressing, and some of the language may be unfamiliar. And if you're unsure of a word, make a wee note, and I'll go through them later. The Argyll papers, housed within Inveraray Castle, is host to many incredible treasures. But for me, one of the most incredible of all is a small collection of seemingly insignificant, grubby, and dog-eared documents, complete with ink blots, marginalia, and very often in illegible writing. It's a record of confessions of witchcraft by 6 women from the island of Bute from the year 1662. They're remarkable for several reasons. That they exist at all is a testament to the work of the archivists and the keepers of the papers through the centuries. The contents shed light on a very murky part of Scotland's history that, through the ages, many people would have preferred had been hidden. However, and unusually, they also contain a fusion between the superstitious beliefs of the Gaeltacht, the Gaelic-speaking areas of Scotland, combined with the more demonic beliefs of the rest of the Scots-speaking areas. And they also contain an insight into the lives and beliefs of the people of Bute, and include talk of fairies, flying, healing, cursing, the devil, shape-shifting, etc. All elements that you would find today in a Marvel superhero movie.
Right.
The 16th and 17th centuries witnessed the height of witchcraft persecutions in Scotland, and whilst witch hunting existed prior to this and continued pretty consistently during this period, Scotland saw 5 major witch panics or peaks: 1590 to 91, 1597, 1628 to 30, 1649, and 1661 to 62. And there are many reasons and theories for these peaks in witch hunting, and one of which includes a correlation to the weather. Europe, including Scotland, was experiencing a little ice age, which resulted in crop failure and resulting hardship. There were also frequent storms, and not to mention various wars, plagues, and famine. However, it was probably a mixture of all these, and as in all turbulent times, the search to apportion blame began. The backdrop to these panics was the publication of 2 texts: News from Scotland, which was a vivid description of the extensive North Berwick witchcraft trial in 1591, written in true tabloid fashion, and another by King James VI in 1597 called Demonology, which actively encouraged the persecution of those believed to be witches by declaring they ought to be put to the death according to the law of God, the civil and imperial law and municipal law of all Christian nations. Now, if the king was declaring that not only witches were real and a threat, but they should be put to death, then all God-fearing subjects had a duty to comply. Few areas were unaffected. However, only 6% of all accusations in Scotland took place within the Gaeltacht, the remaining 94% taking place in the Scots-speaking regions. In all, it's estimated that there could have been as many as 4,000 people accused of witchcraft in Scotland during this time, with 2,500 executed. However, this is probably an underestimate, as many of the records are incomplete and use phrases like many women and several witches, etc. To put this in context, Salem, which we've all heard about, 20 people were executed, with no more than 185 accused. Now, there's much debate over the reasons behind the geographic division of accusations in Scotland, and theories range from those who were believed to be witches in the Gaeltacht were under the protection of the clan chiefs. There were accessibility difficulties with the Highlands and Islands being so remote. Therefore, the kirk had a greater reach, and it was easier to enforce conformity in the rest of Scotland, or that witchcraft was considered a superstitious practice in the Highlands, but a crime against God in the rest of Scotland. The reasoning behind the 94%, 6% difference could, however, be a blend of all these explanations. Another statistic worth noting is the gender split, with 85% of the accused being women. As the island of Bute was easily accessible and under the influence of the kirk, the moral cleansing of witches on Bute began. Now, the island of Bute is a really interesting one, and it makes a relevant and revealing micro-study of the wider Scottish witch hunts, as it's nestled between the Gaelic-speaking Argyll coast and the Scots-speaking Clyde coast. And as such, the population of Bute embraced the beliefs of both cultures. And the confessions are an excellent and relatively rare example of documented cross-cultural and linguistic characteristic. So what was Bute like in the 17th century? Well, in this image, You can see the castle on the right-hand side, the toll booth tower to the left, and just in the middle, you can see the Market Cross, just to the right of the toll booth. Now, luckily for us, Martin, the writer, documented his visit to Bute around 1695, commenting that the town of Rothesay was thinly peopled, there not being above 100 families in it. And he also described the castle as a ruinous fort, round in form, having a thick wall and about 3 stories high, and passages round within the wall. It's estimated that the population of Rothesay in 1662 was between 500 and 700, and the population of the whole island at between 1300 and 1700. And again, for some context, the population of the whole of Scotland at this time was around 1 million people. Interestingly, Martin goes on to describe Rothesay Castle as being only 40 yards of the sea, and the population generally spoke English and Irish, meaning Gaelic, and were mainly Protestant. Now, Martin's description of the castle differs widely from what we know of its location today, which is around 350 yards from the shore, and this is due to land reclamation in the 19th century. So whilst we have a physical description of Bute during the 17th century, we also need to look at sociological conditions. And Argyll justiciary records show that punishments cited for crimes against the state could be brutal. For example, punishment for theft could be that the accused was scourged through the town, meaning a public beating was carried out by the hangman. Alternatively, they could be burnt in the cheek with the letter T as the mark of a piker, and thereafter to be scourged from one end of the town to the other. Or worse, hanged, and all their goods and gear be sheet, which meant confiscated by the state, usually to offset the cost of the punishments. The moral policing of the population, however, was undertaken by members of the Kirk session, and whilst the Kirk session records for 1662 to 1673 don't appear to exist any longer, the surviving records either side of that period provide keen insights into the culture and society in Bute during this period. So what would be considered a misdemeanour today resulted in public humiliation and sometimes banishment in 17th century Bute. The Kirk session records also contain many examples of moral transgression. So, for example, slander, which resulted in the punishment of a paper to be set upon her head containing her faults and thereafter to be banished the town. Additionally, drunkenness risked the person being put in the jugs and her ditty written on her face. And you can see a picture of the jugs here. So this would mean the guilty person would be shackled to the external wall for a period of time. You can still see the remains of jugs on several church walls in Scotland today. Unsurprisingly, there was also much emphasis on adultery and fornication. And on the 21st of March, 1641, in the parish of Kingarth, Bute, Robert Glass was accused of fornication and incest with Mary McConaughey, and he was ordered to stand bareheaded and bare-legged in sackcloth at the kirk door from 1 bell to 3rd, and afterwards in the pillar during the time of divine service, and that for the space of 12 Sabbaths. He was also fined £20, that's Scots pounds, which I think equates to around £200 in today's money. Witchcraft, however, was not only a crime against the state, it was also a crime against God. Therefore, the process for trying a suspected witch saw the state and the church work in tandem. Accusations could be made against a suspect for a variety of reasons and often included historic and perceived slights. For example, accusations could be deliberately constructed in relation to a wish to acquire land and a failure or refusal to cure or neighbourhood dispute. And as we have seen from Martin's description, in the town plan of Rothesay, it was a small settlement on a small island, and the likelihood of people knowing each other or being related to each other would be high. Therefore, an accusation of witchcraft would have far-reaching consequences for the wider community, the accused, and their families. Now, not all witch trials were the same, but I think it's useful at this point to include an explanation of the process which allowed the kirk session to gain a commission from the Privy Council to take a suspected witch to trial. The kirk session dealt primarily with offences against the doctrine of the church and was comprised of ministers and elders who would be alerted to possible suspects by eager members of the local population, so neighbour clyping on neighbour. Depositions would be taken from witnesses. The accused would be questioned and either admonished, or an application would be made to the Privy Council, which was the most senior secular authority answerable only to the Crown. By far the easiest method of getting a commission was ensuring the accused had confessed to being a witch, and even better, having consorted with the devil, having had renounced their baptism, and having been renamed by him. Should a commission be granted by the Privy Council, it was almost certain that the case was serious enough to warrant execution. If found guilty, the accused was executed by strangulation, wired, with their bodies burnt and their possessions confiscated by the Crown. So, what did a witch look like? Well, not like this, but perhaps like this. This is a forensic artist's reconstruction of Lilia Zadie from Torryburn in the east coast of Scotland. She confessed to being a witch, but she died in prison in 1704 before she could be executed. She was buried at low water mark with a large stone put over her grave, but for some reason her skull ended up in St Andrews University Museum and was photographed, which allowed a reconstruction to be done. Her skull has since gone missing. So the common perception of a hook-nosed hag with a tall pointy hat, green skin, black cat and broomstick is a relatively modern construction with elements taken from various times in history and places to make up the image we're all familiar with today when the word witch is mentioned. So who were they then? What did they do? What age were they? So the status of the accused is vastly under-recorded, with only a small proportion mentioned in the records. The records were more likely to mention the status of the husband, if there was one. Where the information is available, though, 245 were married, 67 were widowed, and 7 were unmarried. Not all were poor either. 6% were from rich families, 64% middle class, and 29 were from poorer backgrounds. Of those accused, over 60% were over 40, so middle age and above for that period of time. Midwife as an occupation is a common belief, but on the witch database by Edinburgh University, only 9 are recorded as being a midwife, solely a midwife. But folk healing was much more commonly cited. Probably those at greatest risk, though, were those on the edges of society, or those who had learned healing skills from their mothers and their mother's mother, or those with a mental illness or a disability, or those with a voice, argumentative and sharp-tongued. But in reality, they probably look very similar to you and I. So back now to the confession documents. Whilst the total number of the accused in Bute varies between 54 and 70, depending on which records you look at, we're only going to look at 4 of the women that confessed. And also a caveat, there's no evidence of the questions asked of the women. There's no proof of the answers given because they were recorded by a third party. There's no proof of the conditions in which the women were kept or the duress they were placed under. Also bear in mind the persecution of at least one of the women named in the confessions took place over a period of 40 years. The first documented accusations of witchcraft in Bute came from the early 1630s, when it was the intention of James Stewart, Sheriff of Bute, to request a commission from the Privy Council to try several people who had been detained in the dungeon of Inveraray Castle suspected of witchcraft. Now, I've been in that dungeon, and it's not somewhere you would want to spend any time. It's below ground. It's accessed through a narrow hole in the floor. There's no natural light, and apparently it was liable to flooding. However, feeling slighted that he had been bypassed in the request for the commission, Archibald Campbell, Lord Lorne, made a request to the council that this commission be refused. Now, the council did indeed refuse the commission, but unfortunately the accused appear to have been left to starve in the dungeon, though not before they delated one of our women as a witch. Eventually, in 1662, a commission was granted by the Privy Council, again at the request of James Stewart, Sheriff Deputy of Bute, and 8 others, for the trying and judging of Janet McIlmartin, Isabel McCann, Margaret McIlveen, and Margaret McWilliam within the Sheriffdom of Bute, who have confessed themselves to be guilty of witchcraft. However, we know from the source book of Scottish witchcraft and the confessions made by the women that Janet Morrison and Janet McNichol were also accused. Now, from a very unscientific analysis of the confession documents, I did find that they contained a fascinating mixture of Gaelic-speaking and Scots-speaking cultures. The more commonly cited characteristics within the documents appear to reflect the most popular superstitions of the Gaeltacht. So healing with theatre and ritual and use of numbers. So the number 3 or the number 9 were important. Directions, for example, withershins, which meant anti-clockwise, and the use of south-running water. Cows and milk were mentioned a lot, but these are also found in the Scots-speaking areas. But in the Gaeltacht, and thanks to James VI demonology, it was thought that there was a very close association between fairies and witches, in that they were both servants of Satan. And it was also thought that they had the ability to take the substance of a thing. So the cow, in appearance, remained, but it was no longer able to give milk, or that the milk had been turned. The next one was elf shot and elf blast, which is interchangeable with fairy shot and fairy blast. Now, misfortune was ascribed to fairies and elves, and we have a couple of examples from that period of what shot and blast may be. And the first was from a book written by the Minister of Aberfoyle called The Secret Commonwealth, who states that fairies would use no weapon of iron, but stone like soft flint, shaped like a barbed arrowhead. Sound familiar? but flung as a dart with great force. The other description was from another confession, from an accused witch, at the opposite end of the country, up in Aldern, near Nairn. And it was taken after the Bute confessions. So Isabel Gowdy claimed that she saw elf darts being made, and the devil would shape them with his own hand, and they should be flicked off the thumbnail to the intended target. Another thing that's mentioned is pock, which means a small packet or a pouch containing items, probably including herbs and bones and perhaps nail clippings, etc., used to heal or harm. But the confession documents also included those characteristics typical of trials in Scots-speaking areas. There was mention of the devil, a coven, Halloween or Hallowday, rebaptism, covenant, and to be given a new name. And just a wee clarification, so about Halloween in Scotland. So Halloween or Hallowday is often mentioned, but I believe it's more in relation to pinpointing what was a liminal time of year. I know it was also a superstitious time, a time when people really believed that the veil between this world and the other world was at its thinnest, and therefore spirits, if they wished, could pass through. But it was also a quarter day, and as the first day of winter, it marked a change in the seasons, so it was important to those people who lived on and by the land. Heralding the long dark nights and the short days ahead, families would have been hoping that they had set aside enough supplies to see them through the winter. So, the first of the women we're going to look at, and to be accused, was Janet Morrison, who, on the 15th of January 1662, sent for the minister, John Stuart. I'm not quite sure why she would send for the minister, unless it was maybe to preempt an accusation, who knows. But anyway, she confessed that she had met with a man she knew to be the devil, and she admitted she met a black, rough, fierce man who came to her and desired her to go with him. He went on by saying that thou art but a poor woman and are begging amongst harlots and uncharitable people, and he also promised her wealth. Janet initially rejected the advances of the man, but eventually agreed to meet with him, and upon further questioning admitted she had agreed to be his servant in return for a promise that he would make her a lady, an irresistible offer to someone living in abject poverty. She went on to confess that she renounced her baptism and was renamed Margaret by the man. Janet Morrison was questioned 6 times in total, and each time she reiterated her previous confessions before embellishing them with further detail, in addition to trysting with the devil at least once more. Now, she also mentioned a few of the characteristics associated with Gaeltacht, elf shot, and healing with herbs and charms in relation to cows and milk. For example, Sarah Stewart, one of the witnesses against Janet, accused her of attempting to cure a sick cow. However, after her attempt, it was unable to give milk or calf. Stewart claimed that she, having a cow sick and Janet Morrison coming into her house, she told her thereof and desired her to go see the cow. Said Janet went into the byre and took off her kerchief and struck 3 strakes of her kerchief upon the cow, and that thereafter the cow grew well. So cows and milk feature a lot in folkloric tales, accusations and anecdotes. And rural life in the 16th and 17th century often saw people suffering poverty and deprivation, and starvation was never far away. And a cow could mean the difference between life and death. Janet Morrison also confessed to having knowledge of the fairies, in that she knew the difference between elf shot and elf blast, and that there was no recovery from elf shot, but elf blast can be healed by herbs or charming. Janet claimed to know the cure. Janet Morrison went on to, went on to accuse a further 15 people, including Margaret MacWilliam and Margaret MacLevin. The second of the women to be questioned was Margaret MacLevin, who on the 20th of January 1662, while Janet Morrison was also being held in the toll booth of Rossi, claimed that the devil came to her in the likeness of a man and wanted her to go with him. She refused, but he came back, and then she made a covenant with him. She renounced her baptism, and he renamed her Janet. Margaret also said that the devil wanted to destroy a boat belonging to John Macpherson and William Gillespie. So he carried her under his oxter to Inchmarnock, where she was to put her hand between the two boards of the boat and pull the mast out by the root. But God prevented this as he turned the boat on a different course. She also claimed that at one time she went to the shore of Loch Fyne and raised a storm by casting a stone into the sea. Interestingly, casting something into the sea to raise a storm was commonly cited in witch trials, and casting a dead cat into the sea was one of the main elements of the North Berwick trials, which James VI became personally involved and was widely reported in news from Scotland. Margaret also claimed that when she was at a meeting, she saw people carrying a corpse on a bare tree, which is a frame for a corpse or a coffin, and that a young man fell under it. When someone went to lift him, there was nothing but the stalk of a tree. She confessed to using a Gaelic charm for wristing or brissing, sprains and bruises, and there are many examples of charms cited in the confession documents. However, it was understood that if people were able to cure by charming, they were equally able to harm, so mend or end the recipient. Often the charms were recited in Gaelic. Margaret also confessed to applying the charm of the evil eye to some fishermen, one of whom came home sick. However, she also confessed to having a charm to protect against the evil eye, and she said that she did several times charm both men and beasts therewith, and that it proved effectual and did good to any she applied it. Now, also, once again, we see cows being cited in addition to charming against the evil eye and ritualistic practices, which are all characteristic of the Gaeltacht. And it was believed that the evil eye could belong to anyone and took the form of a desire for property, animals, or even children. Therefore, protections against the evil eye were significant and sought after. Now, despite the dangers which the evil eye was believed to cause, any attempt to prevent or cure it was also seen as witchcraft. Further elements of theatre and ritual are present in Margaret MacLevin's attempt to cure a child. She heals by a herb after this manner. She takes the child with her in her arms to the part where the herb groweth, eschewing meeting or speaking with anybody by the way, and eschewing all highways. And when she comes to the place where the herb is, she takes a broch and lays it upon the herb and plucks up the same, throwing the broch in the child's name, and then brings it home, eschewing, speaking, or meeting with anybody by the way, and seethes it upon the fire, without suffering either a dog or a cat or anything to pass betwixt her and the fire till it be boiled. Whereof she administers drink to the child 3 several times and heals it. So here we see the use of herbs to heal and the use of ritual. Margaret is estimated to have been 29 years old. And Margaret MacLevin went on to accuse a further 30 people, including Janet Morrison, Margaret MacWilliam, and Janet McNichol. Margaret MacWilliam was accused of witchcraft by one of those who were left to starve in Rothesay Castle in 1631. And despite that, and being questioned again in 1645, she was let off. She was questioned once again in 1649, and even though her questioners pricked her and found the devil's mark, through the confusion of the times then, she was let out upon banns. And the confusion of the times is thought to refer to the British Civil Wars, 1638 to 1654, and pricking referred to the process of the search for the devil's mark. So the accused would be stripped naked, shaved, examined for any blemishes, and a pin, often up to 3 inches long, inserted into the skin at the site of a blemish. Should the accused be insensitive to pain or didn't bleed, it was taken as proof of being a witch. Therefore, we can assume Margaret MacWilliam's reputation as a witch was already widespread before the confession was made in 1662. And this is borne out in the documents where it's stated, since the memory of any alive that knew the said Margaret, she went under the name of a witch. Now, we also know from the confession documents that Margaret was pricked again on the 7th of February 1662, and 3 merks found, one up her left leg, next hard by the shin bone, another betwixt her shoulders, and a third one further up her hench. Now her hench is her thigh. She confessed that the year before the Great Snow, which had been about 28 years previously, so about 1634, in a field below her house, there appeared a little brown dog, which then turned into a well-favoured young man, who eventually disappeared in a green smoke. And she also confessed that in a field above her house, the devil appeared to her first in the likeness of a cat, which asked her, "How do ye?" She made a covenant with him, renounced her baptism, and gave him the gift of a cockerel. Margaret went on to confess that when John McPhee, her neighbour, and his father were flitting through one of her fields, they found that she had blocked the gap in the wall through which they wanted to pass. And this escalated into a physical fight between Margaret and McPhee's father, which resulted in an accusation of witchcraft. Following this incident, John McPhee took sick with symptoms similar to childbirth, for which Margaret MacWilliam was blamed, which kept him near a quarter of a year, which was very unnatural, like a woman travelling with sickness, and he suspected the said MacWilliam to have laid on him. Neighbourhood dispute was commonly cited in witch trials, appearing in 120 records in the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft database. Now, another neighbour, Major Ramsay, stated that his cows stopped giving milk, and because Margaret had the reputation of being a witch, he upbraided her, saying, "Give my kye their milk again, or I'll burn thee myself." And she said to him, "Go your ways home, and if you wait, I'll be giving you." And upon his return, the kye gave their milk. Now, tragically for Margaret, things escalated when she confessed that 18 years previously, when she was facing great poverty, the devil promised her riches if in exchange she shot her 7-year-old son with an elf arrow stone, which he gave her. And it's documented in the confessions that William died immediately, which grieved her most of anything that she ever did. It's been suggested that elf shot was one of the explanations to rationalise illness and death by attributing such things to the fairies. And within the Gaeltacht, it was commonly believed that the fairies wouldn't take something without leaving something in its place. Therefore, if a child died and a stock of wood was left in its place, it was believed to be the work of the fairies. Margaret's confession includes extensive, outlandish and fascinating elements, and only a few are included here. Margaret was a mother and a grandmother, and her age was estimated at 56. Margaret MacWilliam went on to accuse 16 other people, including Margaret MacLevin. The last of the women we're going to look at was Janet McNichol, who was questioned on the 23rd of February 1662. And an unusual element of Janet McNichol's confession is the lack of any characteristics other than the devil. When questioned, she immediately confessed to meeting two men, a gross, copper-faced man, and the other a real-favoured young man, and that the copper-faced man, whom she knew to be an evil spirit, bade her go with him. She went on to confess that she made a covenant with him on the promise of riches, and that on renouncing her baptism, he renamed her Mary. This further supported the beliefs of the kirk that Janet had made a pact with the devil. Now, it's also worth remembering that Janet was the last of the women to be questioned, and therefore the questioners would have honed their skills and have been completely focused on gaining the required information in order to get a commission. Additionally, Janet presumably had knowledge of at least one of her co-accused, Margaret McWilliam, who was simultaneously being held and questioned. But by means unknown, Janet McNichol managed to escape her incarceration from the toll booth in Rothesay, and she fled to Kilmarnock. Now, Janet's is the shortest of the confessions, is completely focused on associations with the devil. However, despite being the shortest, is perhaps the most comprehensive record available, as we know from the Argyll justiciary records that 11 years later, Janet returned to Rothesay, only to be apprehended again. She was accused of committing several malfeasance notorious and known to all the country for the crime of witchcraft. And Janet was found guilty and ordered to be taken and strangled to the death, and her body to be burnt at the gallows of Rothesay upon Friday, the 24th of October inst, be 2 hours in the afternoon, and her goods and gear to be escheat. Therefore, Janet's confession is the only one of the 4 women looked at to be comprehensively without any characteristics from the Gaeltacht, but it's also the only one documented from the first confession through to execution. And Janet, in her confession, accused 5 other people, including Janet Morrison and Margaret McWilliam. However, the confession documents left a huge amount unsaid. For example, we don't know the conditions under which the women were questioned, nor the questions asked. We don't know what was written was an accurate reflection of what was said. We don't know whether the women spoke Scots or whether Gaelic was their first language. And if that was the case, we don't know then if they even understood the questions. Moreover, we don't know if they had been deprived of food and sleep, which we know now is a form of torture, but at that point in time, it wasn't considered torture. And it was a very common practice. Or we don't know whether the other women had been tortured in the same way as Margaret McWilliam, by pricking. We do know, however, that the questioning of the women must have been intimidating, often up to 10 male dignitaries, and that on all but 2 occasions they included the minister, John Stewart. We do know that there was an unequal social divide in terms of wealth, education, etc., between the women and their questioners. And we also know that what we would consider torture today had, on the day of her questioning, once again been applied to Margaret McWilliam by the process of pricking her with a long needle on those parts of her body where she may have had a blemish. Equally, whilst there's no doubt the statistics show only 6% of the accusations of witchcraft in the Highlands point to a great divide between the Gaeltacht and the Scots-speaking areas, no single satisfactory explanation for this has been found. Rather, it's suspected that it's a mix of causes, with the reach of the kirk session and cultural beliefs undoubtedly being the greatest. Therefore, and to finish off, and despite the limitations listed above, the confession documents relating to Bute undeniably point to a significant and interesting level of cross-cultural beliefs and characteristics from the Highlands and the rest of Scotland. We also know that these women from Bute and the thousands of others across Scotland and the hundreds of thousands across the rest of Europe who were accused, tortured, and executed for practices which we understand today have no foundation in reality. And on that basis, it's important to remember them. So thank you for listening. I hope it's not been death by PowerPoint, sorry. And thanks to Sharon and Jacqueline and the team for organising. And also just to add on, if you've not yet visited the museum, it's an absolute must-see. It's just wonderful. So I'm happy to take questions, which I'll try and answer. But if you don't know the answer, I'll try and get back to you. And also, if you're interested, I've got a list of recommended reading, both academic and fiction. And I'll pop that in the chat in a wee minute or two. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. Lots of messages saying it was a wonderful talk. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us.
Oh.